What's up YouTube and my fellow precision rifle shooters? Donut here, and today I want to go over win calls and win call strategy. Let's get to it. Now when it comes to wind, obviously we need a way to find out how much wind we're dealing with. So I'm not going to go too much into details because I think there's some great books and other amazing resources to help you guys out, but I will do a quick overview of the different ways you can go about getting an initial wind call. Now, the strategy I'm going to explain to you today, it's kind of something I've developed over the years that can make up for, let's say, a lack of precision in the wind call. All we're actually looking for is more or less a low and a high wind value. We'll get to that after, but right now let's start off with just quick ways that you guys can get a wind reading. The first thing, obviously, a lot of people have on the shooting range, you get yourself one of these bad boys, a Kestrel. Now mine is not very fancy, it's bright yellow. It's not that exciting, and it doesn't even have applied ballistics because I use something else to get my solutions, but this little tool is great for at least finding out what the wind is doing at my location. Now, I like to stress that point because that's all it's good for, really. It's going to give you the wind value that you have where you're standing right now. Now, depending on the range you're at, if it's a big open field, then yes, maybe that wind call will hold true for the entire length of the range. But the thing is, most of the time, there's going to be some obstacles. There's going to be some terrain elevation changes. These things are all going to affect a little bit how the wind travels to the range and how much it's really going to affect your bullet. So what I like to do with my Kestrel personally is more of a training aid. The way I use it is I'll go for a walk and I'll kind of look around and look at a tree and look how the wind is affecting that tree. And then I'll be like, okay, well, this I think is about 8 miles an hour because the leaves are turning around. So what I'll do is I'll tell myself 8 miles an hour, then I pop out the bad boy Kestrel and I see if I'm right, if I'm high, if I'm low. And then what I try to do is build a baggage of experience that I can pull on later on from what I've seen and what I've trained my brain and my senses to kind of feel when I see certain cues from the wind. So either it's going to be how it hits my face, the sound it makes when it's in my ears, how the branches are going to move, how the tall grass is going to move. So that's usually how I go about it. So during a match nowadays, I don't pull it out all that often unless I'm going to be in a big open field with no obstacles, because then, like I said, the wind call we're going to get from this bad boy is going to be more or less close to the truth. And to go back to this thing, what I like to do personally is I like putting this thing on the wind speed max and average screen, and this allows me to have an average of what the wind speed is doing as well as a maximum. So the maximum kind of being our gust wind, and we can use that later on when I explain to you how I go about doing my wind call strategy and my bracketing. The other way we can get a wind call, and I touched on this a little bit when I mentioned the Kestrel, is to kind of look at the environment around this. See what the trees are doing, see what the grass is doing, even the birds. Sometimes we can base our calls on that, and then use that as a way to get our educated guess. Now, I kind of reference the old school Marine sniper kind of list of what a tree does at 5 miles an hour. Those lists I find they're good enough for a ballpark. You can use those kind of as a reference. I keep one in my phone at all times just so I can kind of reference it quickly. And for the most part, it holds true. But the only problem with vegetation, and it's very, very location dependent. So the vegetation you're going to have, let's say in Eastern Canada, is not going to be the same that you're going to get out west. Here in Eastern Canada, we got a lot of trees, we got a lot of leaves on these trees that can move around and give us a call. Whereas if you go out west, it's more plains, it's more maybe tall grass. So obviously these things are going to react differently to the wind. So this goes back to what I mentioned before about the Kestrel, of going out and then maybe using the Kestrel as a reference to back up what you're seeing with your eyes and see if it lines up to the list that's in most of the old school sniper manuals. And then you can kind of adjust it from there. This is more or less how I get my wind calls. I kind of look at what the grass or what the trees are doing, and then I'll kind of base my calls on that. Also, vegetation is great to find the direction of the wind, which we'll come back to a little later, but it's very important to know where the wind is coming from exactly, because it will have a huge impact on how our bullet is affected. The third thing I like to use, and I don't know how many people know about this, but it's a great app. And they also have a website. I found out about it through a friend, and it's also very useful for aviation. But it's called Windy. So WINDY. And basically what it is, it's a map that tracks the high pressure and low pressure cells across the globe and will determine kind of like the air currents and the wind currents. And this, it'll give you the wind speed at a bunch of different altitudes. So for aviation, obviously we're looking higher up, but they'll also have surface wind speeds that you can reference. And I use that personally as kind of like a backup to know that I'm more or less in the general ballpark of what the wind is kind of doing. So in other words, I'll look maybe the night before, I'll see what kind of wind is expected, because that's the great thing about this app is it does do forecasting and uses the exact same wind charts as aviation, and it kind of builds its wind model off that. And then I base myself on that and I look, okay, well, tomorrow the wind, they're calling for 10 miles an hour out of the northwest. So what I'll do is the morning of the shoot, if I have cellular signal, I'll pull out the app and I'll see if it's still holding true. And if I don't have cell signal, at least I have a kind of a reference to be like, okay, so they were calling for 12. My Kestrel is showing me like 13. I'm looking down range. The trees are kind of doing the same thing they're doing on the firing line. Okay, so 12, 13 is kind of more or less holding true. And then I can kind of just pinpoint the direction, make sure that it follows the angle that Windy was showing before. So again, a quick little app, great, easy, really easy. Pop it up, drop a pin where your field is at or where your shooting range is at, and then see what it comes up with. And then you can also use Windy to look what the wind is doing at slightly higher altitudes. So let's say for ELR match, for example, your max ordnance of your bullet's going to be way higher than the ground. So sometimes it's nice to see what the wind is doing at like 500 feet, because maybe that's going to be the reality of what's going to affect your bullet the most. So again, Windy app, they have an app for the iPhone. I'm pretty sure they have one for Android, and they have it as well as a website online. You can go check it out. Very cool. They have a free and a paid version, and this is not an ad. I just think a lot of people need to know this exists because it's a great tool. When we're talking about environmentals, obviously we have to mention Mirage. So the Mirage can be very useful in order to determine your wind. Personally, I don't use it as much for velocity, but what I'll do with the Mirage is mostly use it to see if my winds are changing while I'm shooting. The problem with Mirage is that it's not always present. It's obviously going to be more present on a very sunny day, and usually you'll see it a lot when it comes to transitions in contrast. So let's say you have a target that is white with a black background, where that transition between the white and the black is, or the shadow on the ground. Let's say you have the shadow from the target stand, where that shadow meets the ground. That's where you'll see those waves the most. So usually what I'll do is I'll use maybe the Mirage as a backup to see if like, yeah, my wind call is more or less in the right direction, but know that past about 9 miles an hour, the Mirage just lays flat and doesn't really tell you anything else. So use it more as a sense of knowing if the wind is shifting or if the wind is increasing or decreasing. So let's say you're shooting and you're looking at the bottom of your target stand and you see that all of a sudden the Mirage that was flowing this way stops flowing that way and starts flowing maybe a little more up. Well, you know the wind died. So you can pull back on the wind call a little bit in order to get a hit. So Mirage, again, useful to see. It's not always there. And it's not the end of the world if you don't see it, especially if you're not able to determine the exact angle like they'll mention in some of the old sniper manuals. But it can be useful. So it's up to you to decide whether you trust it or not. But I personally think it's a great way to just know what the wind is doing while I'm shooting, especially on sunny days. Okay, now that we've determined more or less our wind speed, we need to determine our wind direction. There's different ways that you can do this. Obviously, like I said, you can use the Kestrel. The other thing you can do is you can also look at the vegetation and determine an angle to your target. Or what I like to do personally is I tie a little piece of trail marking tape onto the middle of my tripod, and then I kind of look between stages where that little piece of tape is blowing, and that gives me my direction. Now, the reason I talk about direction is because the wind effect is going to be very dependent on its direction. The wind rose that you can use in order to determine the effect of wind is the one I'm putting up on the screen for you guys. And basically, to sum it up, the simplest way is if we look at a clock, okay, well, everything we'll do in clocks, so we'll have 12 o'clock being towards the target, and we're at the center of this clock. Anything that's 1 o'clock or 11 o'clock, it's a 50% wind value. Simple as that. When you go up to 2 o'clock, okay, you're up to 88, 89, 90%. Okay, you're right up there. You're almost at 100%. And then if you're at 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock on the other side, then you're going to be at full value. As simple as that. You don't really need to get into the crazy details on the field. You got so much going on. You got to prepare for your stage. So 12 o'clock, no wind value. 1 o'clock, 50. 2 o'clock, we're looking at 89, 90. And then 3 o'clock, full value. As simple as that. And then you apply that to the wind call. So basically, if you've got a wind from 1 o'clock and your wind call was 6 miles an hour, your actual crosswind is going to be 3 miles. And then you guys can apply that afterwards when it comes to putting that on target. So now that you have a general idea of what the wind is doing, let's look at ways that you can apply this information in order to get more hits on target downrange. So like I mentioned before, what I'm looking for really is a min and a max. So basically, that's why I'm saying you don't need to be the best wind caller. You just need to be able to kind of look out of the range and be like, okay, the wind is at least blowing 6 miles an hour, but for sure, it's not more than 12. So usually you can determine this by, the readings you got on your Kestrel, your average and your maximum, or how the vegetation is behaving based on your mental library of what the trees do when the wind blows X amount. Now that you have your min and your max, this gives you what we call a bracket. Now, brackets are really fun because when we shoot at targets, especially in long-range competitions, these targets are usually pretty wide. We're not looking to hit a 1-inch target at 1,000 yards. Usually the way targets are measured in these competitions is by MOA, and the average size of a target in most competitions that I've seen, that I've been to, unless it's a special stage, is going to be between 2 MOA and 3 MOA. Now, what does that mean? Well, obviously an MOA is kind of a constant angle that stays the same regardless of distance. So in other words, a 2 MOA target at 200 meters is going to be the same as a 2 MOA target at 1,000 meters as far as their relative size to distance. So knowing this, we know that we have a 2 MOA target. Now, most of us have mil scopes. And when you're looking at these targets in MOA, sometimes you're going to be confused because you're going to be like, well, it doesn't relate. They're giving me the target size in MOA, but what is it in mils? Because my scope's in mils. It's pretty easy. Usually 1 MOA is 0.3 mils. So a 2 MOA target is going to be 0.6 mils, knowing that most targets then are going to be between 0.6 and 0.9. We can use this to work on, okay, what wind bracket fits within the width of that target. Let's look at our ballistic data to see how that lines up with the weapon system that we're shooting. So let's say in my case, I'm shooting a 6.5 Creedmoor. I'm shooting a 130 grain Burger out at 2813 feet per second. And if I look at the data for a target that's at 500 meters, every mile an hour is going to push me 0.1 off target at 500 meters. Let's say we go back to our example. Before we were saying, well, the wind's at least blowing 6 miles an hour, but no more than 12. So basically, my basic wind call at 6 miles an hour is going to be 0.6 mils. And my max wind call is going to be, well, you guessed it, twice that, so 1.2 mils. Now, if I do 0.6 minus 1.2, that gives us what? 0.6. And how wide was our 2 MOA target in mils? 0.6. So basically, that tells me that my estimation of what the wind is doing is inside the tolerance of the width of the plate. So basically, then my wind call that I'm going to apply is going to be exactly down the middle between 6 and 12. So I'm going to be holding a 0.9 mil on center of the target. Now I stretch this, make sure this is going to be centered, and this is going to give us a 0.3 mil play on each side of the target, depending on what the wind decides to do while we're shooting. If the wind dies down a little bit, let's say to actually 6, well, I'm going to be on the edge of the plate, but technically I should still connect. Same thing if it gusts up to 12, it'll be the same thing the other way. But anywhere inside that speed between 6 miles an hour and 12 miles an hour, I'm going to get an impact. Now you're going to ask me, okay, well, what do I do if my wind bracket is wider than the width of my target? In that case, then what I would do is I would look at what the wind's been doing all day, and I would determine whether there's more chances that the wind stays closer to 6 miles an hour or if it actually is starting to howl a little bit and is going to go more towards 12. And I'm going to take that bracket and move it towards the extreme that I think is going to be more representative of what's happening down there. So obviously, now your spread is not covering your whole target. So you do have the chance that it might not work out and you might hit, but you'll be darn close. So that's what I would do. And then what I would do is I would try to see splash and then adjust from there. And when it comes to adjusting after you've seen splash, or even if you haven't seen splash, you know that your bracket is a certain width. Don't move a little bit inside that bracket. Move an entire bracket one way or the other in order to maximize your chances of hitting. If my target width is 0.4, then I'm not going to move only 0.2 if I missed. I'm going to move a whole 0.4. I want to maximize my chances of that my correction is going to be on target. So this especially holds true if you feel that you've had a good trigger pull. Like if you feel that, oh, you weren't very stable, you kind of rushed the shot, then maybe it was a miss based on bad fundamentals or bad technique. But if you feel confident about your position and how steady you were, then for sure you need to take that 0.4 target width and then adjust your wind call by a full target width, or else you're just going to be missing again. Because what happens is if you're at the other edge of an extra 0.4, then if you move by just 0.2 or 0.3, it's still going to miss on the side because you're missing that one last 0.1. That being said, don't be afraid to do changes in your wind calls. Like I see a lot of people, they shoot, they miss, but they pretty much do the exact same wind call again. Like you need to move a lot. Always take into consideration the width of the target you have to work with and use that as your reference point for your correction. And you always want to correct to the center of the target. Okay, so if you hit, even if you get an impact and you see your impact, what's great about this sport is that you'll have, usually the targets are hanging on one hanger, so they will move. And the direction they move in is telling you what side of the target you impacted. Don't just shoot the second one at the exact same spot. If you saw the target move to the right, don't shoot the next bullet at the same place. Bring your aim back to the center. Bring that bullet back to the center. That way, if the wind decides to shift again, at least you'll have maximum target width in order to catch that little shift. So just to sum up quickly, what I'm trying to say about the wind bracketing technique is basically you find your high and your low for your wind. Look at the difference in mils that call gives you. So like we said, from 6 miles an hour to 12 miles an hour for my gun, it was a 0.6, okay? And then you look at your target and how wide is your target? Oh, my target's a 0.6. So that I know that if the wind is within that bracket, I'm going to get an impact. And what I do is I put the middle of that bracket, middle of that plate, and that allows me for maximum width if the wind decides to change. So simple as that. Always take into consideration the width of your plate or your target in mils, and do the same thing with your wind call or your wind estimation. Give yourself a low and a high and measure that distance in mils that gives you your bracket, and then place that bracket center on the target and you should get some impacts. Well, that sums up pretty much what I want to talk to you guys about today. Hopefully you'll find my wind bracketing method useful and it'll yield some positive results for you in your next competitions. If you like the information you saw today, please don't hesitate to hit that like button or hit subscribe. And if you want to follow what's happening on more of my day-to-day, you can follow me on Instagram at @thegingerronin. I post more stories there and more pictures about the competitions and the things that I do. So if that's the sort of stuff that interests you guys, get on there and follow me on that platform. So that's it. Until next time, take care.